to housing. And this is a really important topic, I think, for quite a few different reasons. Rights language gets used a lot and thrown around a lot in the political debate. And so whether or not you feel passionately about the question of whether or not housing is a right, you certainly will hear about rights in all sorts of different topic areas outside of just housing. So it's something that it's really important for us all to understand just as citizens. So tonight I'm going to actually break my presentation into kind of 3 parts. The first part is going to be a more sort of the theoretical underpinning of rights. And we're going to discuss rights language from a sort of philosophical standpoint. The second part of the presentation is actually going to be a little bit more practical in nature. So we are going to talk about what it looks like, what a world looks like where we are actually treating housing as a right. And then finally, in the third portion of the presentation, we're going to talk about some alternatives to treating housing as a right and to calling it a right or declaring it a right. So I hope you'll stick with me through all 3 portions, and I promise we're going somewhere with this. So just to begin with, I think it's really important that I state before anything else that it is perfectly consistent to care that people have housing and to meanwhile say that housing should not be called a right and that it is not a right. Let me explain a little bit more why. So first of all, what are rights? This is an incredibly important question, as I mentioned before. Broadly speaking, rights protect us from each other, they protect us from other individuals, and they protect us from government. They protect us from other individuals interfering in our lives or oppressing us, and they protect us from government interfering in our lives and oppressing us. If you think about the traditional rights that are enshrined in the United States Constitution, Bill of Rights, and Declaration of Independence, we can draw on a couple of themes between all of those. You'll remember that some of these rights include the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right to believe what you want to believe, that's the freedom of religion, of course, the right to free speech, and there are others, the right to bear arms, et cetera, et cetera. What are the commonalities between these different types of rights enshrined in the Constitution? Well, I'm going to kind of walk you through a definition of rights, and you may not be able to read the screen perfectly. If you're not able to, I'm sorry. I think this will all be available to you after the fact. So just bear with me on that. The first element of the definition of a right is that rights are enforceable claims against other people. This is pretty simple. This just means that any right that you have must be defended. It can be defended by you, or if government is involved, it will be protected or defended by government. So it's enforceable at the end of the day by some entity or the police force, or individually if we're in a state of nature, meaning that there is no government available to defend it. Second of all, rights are universally held and they're universally obligating. So this sounds complicated, but really all it means is that if something is a right, it is both possible for everyone to claim it, and it is possible and it is provided that everyone is obligated or duty-bound to actually provide that right to other individuals in society. Next, rights are constraints on our behavior. So this is really important. Like I mentioned before, rights protect us from harming each other, from oppressing each other. So I like to think of rights as sort of guardrails or side constraints. So we are able to do all of these things. We have all of these opportunities available to us of actions that we can take in our own lives. And this is freedom and liberty to actually choose which action we want to take. But these guardrails tell us that we can do all those things except for the thing that's going to hurt someone else. So that is how rights are constraints on behavior. And then finally, rights cannot be self-defeating. They can't be contradictory. And what I mean by this is that if I am using my right to something, it shouldn't make it harder for you to use your right to that same thing. Okay, so that was a lot. What does this mean in regards to housing? And I'm going to break this down for housing just piece by piece here. Unfortunately, housing fails on 3 of 4 rights requirements. It fails on the second requirement because if you think about any proposal to provide housing to people, these proposals are never equal in nature. In other words, what we're talking about is not providing housing to every individual in society, and that every individual in society is somehow responsible for doing that for everyone else. So it's not that there's an equality of both obligation and claim. Instead, generally what we hear is that certain individuals, some individuals over here that we think aren't very good at providing housing for themselves, are going to be the ones that will be claiming the right. And meanwhile, over here, you're going to have this group of people that we think are so good that they are going to provide that right. Well, that's not actually equal rights at all. We can talk about what that is in a minute. Next, advocating for housing as a right is not providing housing as a right does not provide a constraint on your behavior. It actually tells you what you must do. You must provide housing. So that's different than saying that you have a right to life, wherein I can live and you can live and we can both live happily in the same society. This sort of gets into it can't be self-defeating or contradictory. If I have to provide you a right to housing, that actually makes it harder for me to provide my own housing. And so the right to housing is actually sort of a self-defeating or contradictory thing. So it really fails on 3 of 4 accounts when it comes to the definition of what a right is. So what is housing if it's not something that we are considering an equal right, if it doesn't fit the definition of right? What is it then? Well, housing is what we're really trying to do when we say that we want everyone to have housing in society is we are just talking about a different distribution of a good. So we are just talking about redistributing housing or redistributing resources. And what we're really looking at here is an equality of results or an equality of outcome, not an equality of right. So let's pretend that you don't buy into this, that you are not really a fan of the theoretical, you don't really care about the political, philosophical background on rights, and you want to just pretend that housing is a right. What then? What if we treated housing as a right even though it actually isn't by definition? How does that look? Well, luckily for you, I'm going to walk you through sort of a more practical, concrete, tangible, hopefully, analysis of what that might end up looking like just so that you can get a sense for it. So if we're playing pretend and saying that housing is a right, though it doesn't fit the definition, we would have to decide some difficult questions. We would have to ask ourselves, as a society, what qualifies? Who would decide what qualifies as housing? Is it that we want to provide everyone tents, everyone mud huts, everyone apartments, everyone mansions? Probably most people will say that it's something in between all of those things. So somewhere in the middle and between the 2 ends of the spectrum there. So not tents and not mansions, but maybe apartments or homes. Okay. Who is going to provide that housing? What I really want to hammer home here is that government does not provide anything on its own. This is something that you will become more and more familiar with after you graduate high school and graduate college. But government can only provide things through the individuals that it serves. So in other words, or that it serves, that actually serve it as well. So individuals living under a government are going to provide the resources to it, which then will be used by government and allocated to housing. So it's actually the individuals that provide either the money, the time, the resources in order to provide the housing. So that's something that we just have to kind of make clear from the get-go. And finally, what is the mechanism that we would actually use? This opens us up to all sorts of questions as well. Will we just tax people more in order to provide housing for other people? Will we actually conscript people? Will we come to their doors, knock on their door and say, we need you outside right now to build housing for your neighbor? These are some of the uncomfortable questions that we really have to answer if we're going to pretend that housing is a right. I'm just going to use some of the sort of moderate, sort of compromised assumptions here as I'm going forward, and you'll see what I mean. So I'm going to assume that actually, and that is so hard to read that I actually need my notes so that I can walk you through this. So hopefully you'll be able to see this after the fact. So what I have on this sheet, if you can't see it, is basically a scenario where I've crunched some numbers. In this scenario, I am looking at what the practical implications of providing housing to the entire United States would be. The entire United States, there's about 325 million, million people that are living here among us. The median household price, or home price, I should say, in the United States is $193,000, almost $194,000. And we take in, the federal government, I should say, takes in about $3.2 trillion in tax revenue a year. So if we provide that type of housing, just the median type of housing to every person, it would take us 20 years to do that if we spent every single penny of tax revenue on housing, which of course we wouldn't do, and is politically completely unfeasible because we have other things that the federal government likes to provide, such as military that will protect us, infrastructure, roads and hospitals and schools and things like that. So this would never actually happen. But nonetheless, in our hypothetical scenario, that's how long it would take us to provide each individual with that type of home. But you might say, wait. I think that some individuals are actually going to live in families. So I've baked that in the second line there, the second assumption. You can see how long it would take if we provided that the average household size in the United States is 2.53 people, which it is. It would take us 8 years if we devoted every single dollar, every single cent of federal tax revenue to this one purpose, which is providing housing. And of course, doing that, we would actually be behind in 8 years because the population would be growing in the meantime. But what you have to remember is that rights actually traverse borders. So it's not only that we would be needing to provide housing to the United States population, but really our obligation with rights, because they're universally held and universally obligating, is we would need to provide it to the entire world population. So what does that look like? Well, there you can see, I hope, on your screen, that the world population is what now? 7.4, let's see, a Habitat for Humanity home costs about $135,000 to build. So I'm not even using the average American, or the median American home price anymore, but a little lower number. And if you're providing that type of home to the entire world population, and assuming that the world wants to live in sort of family configurations that are similar to the United States, so an average household size of 2.53, it would take us 123 years in order to provide that housing at the worldwide level if we devoted every single penny of tax revenue to it. Of course, we couldn't do that because there are many other obligations that the federal government has, but just for the purposes of this hypothetical. So we see that not only would it be very difficult fiscally, potentially very fiscally irresponsible and economically challenging to try to provide something like this, there are also other rather unsavory implications. So it's not that you can just provide everyone a house and nothing else happens. Nobody changes their behavior. In fact, people do change their behavior. They respond to the incentives that you provide them. They respond to their circumstances. So we predict, or I would predict, that when you provide people with housing for free, by right, you're going to have certain things happen. And, an Economics 101 class would predict the same thing. So this is nothing earth-shattering. This is just sort of what is believed to be the cause and effect of providing certain benefits. So for one thing, you would reduce the labor force participation worldwide. In other words, not as many people that can work would work. This would compound your budget problems, of course, in the United States, because not as many people working means not as much federal tax revenue, which means that it's even harder to pay for these programs. Additionally, housing assistance, it doesn't just lower employment, but it also lowers earnings more than it lowers employment. At least that's what the academic literature tells us. This might be even a more troubling effect than we think it is, because people are not actually progressing in their careers in the same way that they would be otherwise, and so they're not maybe making those promotions or raises. Additionally, you have an implied reduction in innovation and in economic growth that would occur as a result of less people working and less people involved in the labor force. And what's problematic about that is that actually really it means a decline in the quality of life that we all experience. And finally, you can always expect, whenever you provide any type of welfare benefit to individuals in society, that the configurations of families and the robustness of civil society, which is really family and church organizations and clubs and things like that, will change somewhat. And I would expect that it would deteriorate somewhat in this case. People wouldn't have to live together in the same way that they did before. They may be able to all live separately. That's actually a bad thing for civil society. Not having people relying on each other, but having people actually relying on government is a bad thing for civil society. Okay, so if it's true that housing is not a right by definition, and if it's true that treating it like a right has very negative fiscal and economic impacts, how else can we treat housing? Is it possible for us to actually provide housing to individuals without calling it a right? The answer to that, luckily, is yes. We absolutely can provide housing to individuals, and we can actually do a better job of providing housing to individuals through other mechanisms than by legislating it as a right or calling it a right. We have a couple of the solutions that I'm going to touch on here. So free markets, volunteering, philanthropy, reductions in regulations that strangle the free market are all ideas. So I'm going to walk you through those. So first of all, free markets are key. Just to put it in perspective for you, I know that we are very concerned about providing housing to individuals, particularly the homeless, and we should be. This matters a lot. We want to take care of each other. But freer markets do a much better job of doing that. And when you start to declare housing a right, you by default have to become more and more interventionalist when it comes to the market, the housing market. So here I just pulled a couple of the countries that are freer and a couple of the countries that are the least free economically. And I looked at their homelessness rates. In the United States, we have not even 1% of the population that is living in homelessness, thank heaven. In Switzerland, they have even less than we do, and of course they are actually economically freer than we are. We fall under the, I believe, somewhat free category, or maybe it's a little bit better than that, mostly free category. Switzerland is categorized as being very free economically. Now, Venezuela and Zimbabwe, it was actually hard to find numbers on some of the least free economies as far as their homelessness rate, because those economies are so closed that they don't publish data. They don't provide data publicly. But Venezuela and Zimbabwe apparently do. And those are some of the least free or unfree countries in the world. And as you can see, their homelessness rates are multiple times larger than the United States or Switzerland homeless rates. In fact, the Venezuelans have, I think, declared housing to be a right in all sorts of different legislation, possibly even in their constitution. I looked into this at one point in time. And it's projected that in a couple of years from now, so in 2019, almost, 40% of the population of Venezuela will live in government-provided housing. And these pictures on the screen here, I wasn't trying to, create a biased collage or anything like that. I just picked the first picture off of a Google image search when I typed in Venezuelan housing, Zimbabwe housing, Switzerland housing. And as you can see, it's not just that a freer market does a better job providing housing by the numbers, but the quality of that housing is also much, much better in a freer market. What are some other ways that we can provide housing outside of making sure that our markets stay very free and fluid, which, by the way, we don't actually exist in a totally free market in the United States, just so you're aware, and there are things that we can do to actually make that market for housing freer, and we can talk about that in Q&A if you're interested. But outside of this free market, there are other ways to get involved. One way, of course, is volunteering. I think I mentioned Habitat for Humanity earlier in this presentation, and it certainly, this is a non-profit organization which provides housing to low-income families in the United States, domestically and internationally, and they do quite a good job of it. They build thousands of housing units all over the United States every year. I have an intern who's actually worked on about 50 housing projects, Habitat for Humanity housing projects, just in the state of Florida over the last couple of years. So they are really out there doing it. And they are a completely voluntary organization. If you care about housing, then you can get involved with them. And certainly if any of you are interested, you should look into it. They love to have young recruits that are willing and able to build. Outside of sort of joining an organization and providing your own time, you can also down the road voluntarily provide your own money. This slide, I think, is very hopeful. This is the total charitable giving that United States Americans have provided over the past, I don't know, let's see, 40 years or so. And in fact, in the past 2 years, well, in 2015 and 2014, I think that's the latest numbers that we have here, those years were the most, broke records for the most charitable giving ever. 99%, in fact, of high net worth individuals in the United States give to charity, and 80% of those high net worth individuals are giving to basic needs organizations. So organizations that specifically target things like housing and food and clothing and things like that. So this is definitely something that you can keep in mind for later on. Best of all, charity is more effective. So the numbers on charitable giving are such that it looks like about 70% of the dollars that are spent at the average organization are given directly to the individuals in need. Only 30% are given to the administrators, the people who are working at the nonprofit, sort of the overhead costs. When you look at government welfare programs, it's the exact opposite. About 70% of the money for welfare programs in the government are given to government bureaucrats, administrators, overhead costs, and only 30% of that money makes its way to the recipients, to the individuals that need it most. Okay, so we're about wrapping up here. So in summary, what are the takeaways? Number one, philosophically, housing does not fit the definition of a right. Number two, if we were to pretend that housing was a right and act like and treat it like a right, it would be almost inconceivably burdensome and difficult and fiscally irresponsible for us to try to treat it in that way. It would be nearly impossible to achieve our objectives. And number three, it is still perfectly congruent to say that you do not want to treat it that way through government or use government coercion in order to provide housing to people, and also say that you do care about people having housing, and there are very good ways to help provide that to them, to people that need it most. Thank you so much for listening, and now I am looking forward to reading some of your questions here. So let's get started. All right, I'm going to have to start scrolling through these. Let's see if I can figure this out, guys. Okay, so the first question is, out of curiosity, assuming that we plan to use this in our debate, do you have any source for this information? And in parentheses, the chart. Thank you, Michael, for that question. I'm not sure, I'm guessing that the chart that you're talking about is this one right here, or perhaps this next one. So I actually crunched these numbers myself, but I do have reference information if you're interested in where I got the numbers on household size or population or median home price. You can really Google any of this stuff. The median home price, for instance, I think I pulled that off some U.S. Census Bureau or American Housing Survey data set. Population, you know, you can just do a Google search on the current population in America. I think this is what you're talking about, I hope. The total cost, I mean, right here, you just are multiplying these things together, right? And then when it comes to the time frame, you're just dividing the total cost by the number of federal tax revenue dollars that we collect in any given year. So I hope that that helps. Okay, let's move down. Okay, yeah, so it looks like you were saying scenario one. Andrea says, why is military spending a priority over affordable housing? That's a really interesting question. I would say for one thing, again, the government's initial sort of purpose is to protect us from each other. And if you don't have security, so in the hierarchy of needs, do you guys know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs? I'm guessing some of you have taken a psychology class. In order to have many of the other things in the hierarchy of needs, the things that you want, you have to start with a base level of kind of like safety and security. It's key. So if you have a foreign invasion happening on your soil, for instance, then it's very hard to say that anyone has housing, right? Because it can be taken away from you at any given moment. So you have to start with some base level of safety and sort of stability in order for anyone to even have property rights. And property rights set you up to have sort of the ability to provide yourself with a house. I hope that helps. Could you give us a link to your sources? So I'm not sure which sources we're talking about now. If you're, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I can provide links to anything that you want here. If you want a link to the Total Giving, there is actually a source down at the bottom there. It's the Giving USA Foundation 2016 numbers. You can just pull that off the internet. You can go searching for it. The list of homeless countries and the percentage of people that are homeless in any country, I can't remember where I got that, but I can track it down super easily. So I am happy to send some of these things to you all through Kate after the presentation. Let's see. Okay, Kate says to tell you all that she will email you the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, Jonathan Kelly says, if something is a right, doesn't the government have a moral obligation to provide that right for everyone? I would say, yeah, generally speaking. I'm not a political philosopher, so I don't want to take a super strong stand on that particular question. But yeah, generally speaking, that's what government is for, is to protect our rights. The problem is that with housing, as we already discussed, housing is not actually a right by definition for all sorts of different reasons. Okay. All right, Michael asks, could you define economically free? I'm sorry, everybody's asking questions. Okay, thank you. Sure, I can definitely define economically free. So in an economically free society, you are going to have voluntary transactions happening. Instead of having somebody at the top of the sort of government pyramid who is deciding how many houses you need, for instance, in this context, how many you should build and where you should build them, you have the private market deciding that, and that's happening through voluntary exchanges. People on the ground are deciding, I want to build a house here, and I'm going to build a house for myself, rather than the government saying, I think we need to build public housing, as is happening in Venezuela, for 100% of the population eventually. Instead of having the government really involved and entrenched in the housing market, you have private citizens or private companies building housing for themselves. But then even more broadly than that, a free market has other aspects too, right? It has free trade, it has low taxes, it has low tariffs. There's all sorts of other components. And if you're interested in looking at how that ranking was done in particular that I was using on this Free Markets Are Key slide, then I would suggest that you go check out the Heritage Foundation, because they put together an index of economic freedom on a yearly basis, and I pulled it directly from that. All right, Carrie is asking, where are you getting the homelessness statistics? Again, I apologize. You guys really want the data sources, and I love you for that. I can't remember. Okay, the homelessness statistics came from all sorts of different places, because there's not actually, as far as I'm aware, maybe there is somewhere, there's not like a World Bank ranking of homelessness. So I had to pull these from different unique sources. Again, I'm happy to provide those sources. They came from different places because, of course, the different countries are publishing these statistics separately rather than together. Jonathan says, I think this is an important point. If housing is a right and a government has an obligation to provide us rights, isn't it unjust for the government to fail to provide us these rights? Okay, so David Edwards says, I agree with Jonathan. Doesn't the government lose legitimacy if it fails to do its duty to protect and provide rights to people? So I think that I think we're having still some difficulty in the definition of what a right is. So I'm just going to take us back a little bit and see if I can describe it a little bit better, hopefully. So maybe one way to think about this that would be more useful is that rights are things which limit behavior. They limit other people's behavior, and they limit the government's behavior. This is what negative rights are. There's this term called negative rights. Now, some people think that there are positive rights. And if you are ever calling housing a right, then you're basically calling it a positive right. Positive rights are things which require you to actually actively do things. They tell you you must do such and such. So you must pay more money to the government so that they can provide housing to someone else. That is an example of a positive right. The reason why we don't like positive rights is because they lead to the oppression of the individual. So there's a big difference between telling somebody that there are certain things that you can't do over here, but there are all of these things that you can do. You can do everything else, but you can't do this little itty-bitty thing. Versus a positive right tells you that you must do certain things, that you absolutely must and are required to do them. And that limits your ability as an individual to choose, to have choice, to have freedom, to have a say over yourself. And most fundamentally, I think we all agree that self-ownership is really key. It's sort of the first right, the most fundamental right is self-ownership, the ability to choose what to do with yourself, when to do it, as long as it doesn't hurt other people. And that is infringed upon when you start telling people that there are positive rights. I think there's another thing to be said here, another argument to be made, which is that if you start to call housing a right, then you have to wonder what is not a right anymore? Is a car a right? Is, I don't know, a Prada bag a right? That might seem extreme, but there's no clear differentiating line between all sorts of different goods that we would want to put in that same bucket. So if you're talking about positive rights, rights are endless and they're completely unprovidable by government. I hope that that helps a little bit. Okay. Just reading through Kate's comments here on the side, and then I'm going to keep scanning down. Okay, I may have to skip over some of these just because we don't have forever here, so bear with me. Let's see. Would a plan to provide housing be exclusive to United States citizens or all people who are residing in the United States? Yeah, if something is truly a right, then it would apply to all individuals in the United States, and it would traverse borders, as I mentioned before. So it would also apply to individuals worldwide. Where is the definition of rights from? Well, you can look up, if you're interested, I'm guessing that you want sources again here, and that's what you're trying to get at. You can look up natural rights, you can look up negative rights, you can look up Robert Nozick, and you can read some of he was a Harvard philosopher, political philosopher, and you can read some of his writings. Okay, let's see. Would it be considered just to only provide people below a certain household income with housing as a right? Okay, so this is really key. If you're just providing housing to some people, remember, that is not a right. The reason being that it actually conflicts with definitional component of rights number 2 here, which is that rights are claims that everyone has and that are universally obligating. So you would need to be providing housing to all people and providing it by all people, in the same way that the right to life is provided to everyone, and everyone can claim that, and we all have the obligation to provide that right to life to everyone else. I hope that helps. Okay. Carrie says, your presentation is great for con. What points would you make for pro that the U.S. ought to guarantee the right to housing? I think that what you're going to see here when you debate someone, or when you are the person who's debating on the other side, if I had to guess, and obviously, I'm not going to argue with myself completely, but I assume that what you're going to see on the other side is that people will say, just think about Bobby Joe. He is living on the street. It's not fair. He has a horrible life. If we just gave him housing, then all of these other things in his life would become better. and he would be healthier, and he would be more involved in work, and he'd be able to get a job, and he would be happier, and maybe he could get married, and all these other things. So what I'm trying to say is that when people make the argument in favor of guaranteeing housing as a right, most likely they will appeal to pathos, so they will appeal to emotion. So it's not likely to be a particularly rational, logical discussion. It's likely to be more emotionally driven. I'm sure that people will find ways to make it more rational and logical, but I think that that's mostly what it will boil down to. Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? Okay, I think that this is actually really interesting, and I feel bad that I haven't got through all the questions yet. Cherry says, with the history of redlining and discriminatory housing practices, could we realistically move to say housing should be a right? This is a really interesting question. So I think that there's a difference between what you're suggesting. So redlining, for those of you that aren't familiar, is basically a way of preventing racial minorities from moving into certain neighborhoods. This is actually a really horrible thing that happened in American history over the course of the 20th century, and it happened in some cities and neighborhoods. And that was something that happened through government policy in a lot of cases. In fact, aside from redlining, another way that people kind of redlined was through zoning regulations, and actually this still continues to happen today, where the government will actually say, well, not exactly the government, the citizens will come to the government and they will say, we only want you to be able to build, we only want people to be able to build large single-family homes in our neighborhood. And so what does that do? It keeps racial minorities in cases where race is correlated with income. In other words, when poor people are also racial minorities, it keeps those people out of those neighborhoods. Now, saying that that is absolutely wrong, which it is, and I am the first to say that we should reduce zoning regulations. In fact, I spend a lot of my time thinking about zoning regulations and how we can reduce them and how we should reduce them. And although I am the first to say that redlining is horrible and we should have never done that, that is not the same as saying these are two different, separate issues. Whether or not the government should prevent people from moving into certain neighborhoods, the answer to that is absolutely no. The government needs to respect individual rights. But that's not the same as saying that the government should now decide that they're the developer and that they're going to develop housing for every racial minority. These are two very different arguments. So I hope the way that I've explained it, it makes sense to you that these are not the same thing. You can be very much against redlining, and that has nothing to do with whether or not you want the government to actually get involved in producing housing, as they do through actually public housing today. Sophie says, how would you suggest that we affirm this resolution, that housing ought to be a right? No, I would absolutely argue that it should not be a right. And I hope that my presentation helped make that more clear if it was confusing at the beginning. Would a plan to provide housing push our national debt past the point of no return? If it was provided as a right, by right, then the answer to that is yes, because that would mean that we were actually providing housing for every individual, and that would be, as I hope I showed you in scenario one, that would definitely push our budget, our debt past the point of no return. In fact, already at this point in time, there's $22.5 trillion that we're holding in debt in the United States, and we have the highest debt to GDP ratio that we have had in 100 years right now today. And that's without deciding that we're going to provide housing for everyone, which is extremely expensive. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have here? These are some good questions, very good questions. Let's see. Just want to scan through and okay. Yeah, in answer to Jake's question, how would a right to housing affect banking in our country? It's a good question. I think that the banking sector, I'm certainly no expert when it comes to monetary policy, but I definitely believe that the banking sector would be out of business, that there would be a reduction in business. People wouldn't need to go get a loan, right, if the government is providing housing. The government is actually would be the one that was taking out loans. And so from a consumer perspective, that would most likely be the change. Let's see, this person, I'm not sure that's the most satisfactory. According to the definition of economic freedom, don't all social programs violate economic freedom by deciding who deserves what? You would have to go in there and look at what Heritage Foundation uses in order to calculate economic freedom, and I can't remember exactly what I said the definition was before, but certainly when you interfere with individuals by producing more and more tax burden on them, that definitely reduces economic freedom, and it does it in multiple ways, right? It makes it so that individuals don't actually get to choose what to do, where to invest their money, what to do with their money. It also makes it so that individuals are much less likely to want to work hard, and because of that, they are very, very likely to, be more dependent on some of these social programs and government benefits, and it's kind of just a bit of a downward spiral. But yes, according to that definition of economic freedom, social programs do actually reduce economic freedom somewhat. Okay, I'm trying to see if I missed any. Okay, I think this is maybe kind of the second time that I've got this question, but Lewis mentioned that in debate we have to argue both sides. If there are any arguments that might be helpful on the other side, I certainly don't want to make the arguments for the other side because I don't think that they're correct, which I hope that you all have understood throughout this presentation. Nonetheless, I think that probably people on the other side will try to talk about the United Nations, I can't remember what it's called, Basic Rights Charter or something like that. You can look it up, where basically a whole bunch of countries tried to talk about all sorts of different positive rights, like housing, as being actual rights which they want to provide for through government. I also just wanted to mention on an earlier question, I'm not sure that I really covered this in the presentation, but some of you mentioned redlining. I think it's really important that you know that regulations that interfere with the free market, like zoning regulations, they constrain housing supply, and so they actually increase the price of housing for poor people specifically. So I really want you to know that even when governments like Venezuela's government or Cuba's government declare housing as a right, there are things, so there's two things here. Number one, we can actually provide housing much better, much higher quality through a free market. And on top of that, there are certain things that we can do to make the market even freer that will make it so that our government, not our government, the free market is actually much, much more effective at producing this housing that we want everyone to have at the end of the day. Okay. I'm just going to take this one last question, and then I think we're going to sign off here. Oh, man, I just got a long one. I'm going to have to move up. I'm sorry, Michael. Ben asks, if we were to lower the cost of the housing built, is it possible to provide cheaper housing? That's a great question. Generally, what we like to talk about in housing policy is filtering, which means that actually we build new housing. That housing costs a lot, and then the older housing filters down to lower income individuals. So the more new housing you build, the better, because older housing becomes cheaper when there's more competition, when there's more opportunities, there's alternatives to that. That has answered some of your questions. I hope this was helpful. I wish you all well in your debate, and I'll turn it over to Kate now.
Hi all, that's about all we have. I want to have all of us join me in thanking Ms. Calder for her presentation and answering questions. I'm just going to go ahead and over to here. We have a really quick survey.